Hello, History 72B, Spring Quarter 2023. We have 3 more weeks of class left at the time that I'm making this recording. Maybe not when you watch it, maybe then we'll have even less. After World War II, women did not all go home, but their options of employment became more constricted, and their pay dropped considerably with respect to white men. And that's what I'm talking about when I say World War II and following. Women were changing into women's work, which could be paid less. We will look at how patterns of employment, or lack of it, went hand in hand with changes in the distribution of populations, looking first at the forming suburban middle class and then at the urban working class. Suburbia, as it is conceived of in the U.S. now, came into being in the wake of World War II. On 8 May 1945, the U.S. and its allies declared victory in Europe. This was the end of part of World War II, although war in the Pacific dragged on for longer. Even before VE Day, however, the U.S. had begun to plan for the massive project of demobilization and returning soldiers to American society and economy. Part of that planning came in the shape of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or GI Bill of Rights, legislation that would change the shape and distribution of American population in the decades after the war. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or GI Bill of Rights, passed in 1944, granted returning veterans benefits for homeownership, business startups, and education. Supposedly, the GI Bill offered everyone who had served honorably in the armed forces access to low-cost mortgages, business loans, educational assistance, and unemployment compensation. This sounds great, and it was for straight white men. We've already seen the sexism and racism built into military service. So even had everything been equitable in the implementation of the GI Bill, that racism and sexism would have emerged in who was eligible to claim benefits and who was not. But it happened that the GI Bill was made even more inequitable by assumptions about race, sex, and the male breadwinner family structure across the U.S. The GI Bill was not just a gesture of goodwill toward men, and I do mean men who had served. It was also intended to help consumer demand and avoid the boom and bust that had followed World War I. Corporations were quick to advertise the pleasures of peaceful post-war family living with automobiles, washing machines, and most of all, homes in which to keep those things. William Levitt, who had built barracks and war workers' housing, remade the idea of the American neighborhood. Abandoning the standard practice of constructing houses individually, he cleared a massive profit by mass producing an entire community, building what were called tract homes. Houses were built in 27 steps, with different groups of construction workers specifically trained to perform each step. A crew of 36 men could build a house in a single day. Homes in the original New York Levittown that you see pictured here went on sale in March of 1947, and 1,400 of them were purchased in the first 3 hours alone. Not 3 days, 3 hours. The first Levittown in New York transformed 4,000 acres of farmland into a planned community with 17,450 nearly look-alike homes, 17,500 homes designated for whites only. The image here is from Levittown, Pennsylvania, and as tract housing spread, so did racial segregation. The single-family dwelling became a staple of the American dream only in the post-World War II GI Bill era. The federal government, through the Veterans Administration, or VA, provided home loans to 1/5 of the nation's single-family households between 1945 and 1966. Half of these were in the rapidly growing Southwest and California. The VA loans coincided with Federal Housing Administration programs designed to democratize, and I am putting that word democratize in quotes, homeownership. The program did this 3 ways, but the most critical was that the FHA encouraged private banks to lend to middle and low income applicants by ensuring that the government would cover defaulted loans. This will be important when we talk about redlining and the GI Bill in a later lecture. You will also see some of this in your reading on Oakland included in this package. The GI Bill and associated programs grew the American middle class like nothing before or since, but it did this while entrenching discrimination against women and racial minorities. Former soldiers got preference for jobs and college admission over non-veterans, most of whom were women. Married female veterans did not receive unemployment benefits and had their educational stipends reduced unless they could prove that they were the main breadwinner in their family. Racist policies at universities, banks, and new housing developments like Levittown prevented veterans of color from using their GI benefits. As the image on the slide notes, in some suburbs, fewer than 100 out of 67,000 mortgages went to non-white borrowers. As historian Elaine Tyler May has shown, after the war, government propaganda urged women to go home as wives and mothers, not only to release jobs for returning veterans, but also to promote the notion that the nuclear family was the foundation of democracy and had to be protected. Women were ready to embrace marriage. Housework, not so much, but the policies of the government, private sector employers, and unions made it difficult for women to avoid economic dependence, even when they held jobs. The number of women with wage jobs stayed high, but the economic status of employed women basically tanked. The average weekly pay for white women dropped from $50 to $37. Women saw a 26% drop in pay compared to a national post-war decrease of only 4%. According to Tyler May, 3/4 of women who had been employed in war industries continued in the workforce, but 90% of them were earning significantly less than they had during the war. Women, as well as gay men, were pushed out of the military. Queer service members were often not given an honorable discharge, meaning they were not eligible for veterans' benefits. Fewer than half of American women who had picked up skills in the military were able to find the skilled jobs for which they were qualified. Worst of all, female veterans were considered dependents rather than providers in their families, and were therefore deemed ineligible for the veteran benefits available to male former service members. I've given you a recruitment video to watch for women, and despite what that video you have suggests, the government did not provide much in the way of childcare during the war for women who worked. This was a deliberate choice to keep women from getting too comfortable in wage employment. The few childcare facilities that the federal government had created closed after the war, and white mothers with small children faced intense pressure to devote themselves to the home and get out of the job market. The term pronatalism describes the push to have certain women have more children. It is part of the eugenics strategy. I don't know how clear it is in this image, but the nurse back here is distributing chocolates to new mothers as a reward for popping out babies. And she looks ever so spry. I didn't look that spry. But not all women have children. And most of us stop having children after a certain point, but we continue to exist. The number of employed women between the ages of 20 and 34 dropped dramatically. 2 million left the workforce, but this did not represent a reduction in the number of women overall who work. Older women entered the paid labor force in an expanding pink-collar sector, so the overall number of women in gainful employment increased. Pink-collar jobs are jobs that are coded as female. This image that you have shows waitressing, which is a classic example, but nursing, secretarial work, and K-12 teaching are also pink-collar jobs in the US. Typically, pink-collar jobs are paid less than related white and blue-collar jobs, regardless of the level of actual skill and years of training involved. The restructuring of the female labor force was disastrous for Black women. Although they made slightly more than before the war, their income was still less than half of white women by 1950, and white women were paid significantly less than white men. The jobs available to women hardly challenged domestic power relations based on the assumption of a male breadwinner. A wife's wages and status were designed to be lower than her husband's, so her work would always be cast as supplementary and not permanent, leaving him in the higher status position of provider for the family. The largest growth in pink-collar employment was working for white-collar men. Most of these positions for women were jobs, not careers. By 1960, 10 million wives were employed, triple the number from 1940, but less than half of these worked full-time. I always find it helpful to remember at this point that the generation emerging from World War II in the US had only known precarity. They had been children and teens as their families struggled through the Great Depression, and then had spent their young adulthood in the most total and destructive war up to that point. The idea of being able to focus on family and consumer goods was genuinely appealing to those who could have it, especially to younger married women struggling with caring for growing families in isolated tract homes. And for older married women, a job was an acceptable alternative to the full-time homemaker role that allowed for the purchase of consumer goods that had either been out of reach or not even existed in previous decades. The GI Bill included education as well as home loans, another factor in the creation of a burgeoning white middle class. The GI Bill paid for 3 years of a veteran's tuition, providing he was a man and not a married woman, plus a living allowance. Over 6 million men entered colleges, universities, and training programs in the wake of World War II thanks to the GI Bill. By 1947, veterans accounted for about half of college enrollments, but we need to put this into the context of a country in which education was still segregated by race, still legally segregated by race. The number of spots available to Black veterans stayed limited, and while colleges and universities experienced tremendous growth, that did not apply equally to Black colleges and universities. College enrollments also increased for women during the post-war years, but not at anything like the rate for men, so that even though more women were enrolled in absolute numbers than in previous decades, they made up a smaller proportion of the student body. White women were also far more likely to drop out than white men. Career prospects for women were so limited that it made more of an economic difference for them to marry a man with a higher degree than to pursue the degree themselves. One study cited in Tyler May showed that young white women were twice as likely to enter college as their mothers had been, but were actually much less likely to finish their degrees. For white middle-class women, social mobility through college came through a so-called MRS degree. And you can see, the difference that the GI Bill made, and you can see the difference relative to women's enrollment in college during the post-war period. For Black women, the situation was quite different. Most Black women had mothers and grandmothers who had been involved in wage labor, and they expected to be so as well, college or no. College degrees for them would greatly improve occupational prospects. Fewer Black women than white entered college, but 90%, 90, of those Black women finished their degrees. It was not that all white women necessarily wanted to accept affluent domesticity, but that it represented a pragmatic acceptance of reality. A survey of 5,000 women who graduated from college, white women who graduated from college between 1946 and 1949, found that only half of these women had been able to find the kind of work they had wanted and for which they had prepared. Those who had aimed for pink-collar jobs, like teaching, nursing, and secretarial work from the very beginning, were far more successful than those who sought work in male-dominated fields like science, psychology, journalism, or music. Of those who trained in professional fields, over half ended up in clerical jobs. Unsurprisingly, the rate of dissatisfaction ran high among this group. Prior to World War II, most colleges had forbidden undergraduate students to marry, but the influx of former GIs changed this. Both men and women were encouraged to marry young, and it was made clear to white middle-class women that their road to success was expected to lie through helping their husbands' career prospects. This meant that while married men tended to stay in college and benefit from marriage, most young wives dropped out to support their husbands. One college textbook, I'm going to say that again, college textbook assigned to women stated, "Nothing is to be gained by women's trying to imitate men. Chances for marriage are greatly reduced if they, women, do not make a permanent attachment during the college years." Now, this wasn't just a threat of, you'll be a dried up old spinster and no one will love you. This was a threat of, you will not have the economic means to support yourself. Meanwhile, Ladies' Home Journal advised in 1949, many young men find that they can do much better work if they get the girl out of their dreams and into their kitchens. That was said without any sense of sarcasm whatsoever. Middle-class white women were literally told that they were crazy if they planned to do anything other than marry over the long term. Tyler May found a post-war guidebook for women that included a test of neurotic tendencies for women. One of the questions is on the slide here. Question: you are a clerk at a bank. A new clerk, a man who is intelligent and ambitious, comes to work beside you. How do you respond? A, work harder to show that you are superior to him. B, be friendly and helpful, since he may be your boss someday. C, help him as little as possible, since that's the way you had to learn. And here we have the answers. Any woman who looked after herself was neurotic, and she could probably count on the man being her boss, whether he was better at his job or not. Women of the preceding generation watched in horror as feminist gains from earlier decades vaporized. One woman, born in 1885 and a professor of English at the University of Illinois until her retirement in 1954, wrote, "For those last 10 years," so that would be late 40s, early 50s, the post-World War II years. "For those last 10 years, I felt increasingly that something had gone wrong with our young women of college age. I noted it all with growing alarm and anger. I thought when I started teaching that since the battle to open doors to women had been won, all that was needed was for us to buckle down and show what stuff we were made of." This, again, is one reason why I say beware of relaxing into a sense of inevitable progress. It is so easy to turn it around. White colleges responded by creating a separate course track for women designed to prepare them for middle-class marriage. In the words of a speaker for the National Organization of Women, looking back in 1973, what universities are offering is an education designed to turn out efficient little suburban housewives with minor marketable skill so they can enrich their children's lives and not disgrace themselves in front of husbands' business associates. That was the story for middle-class white women, and it would be a story that has influenced policies toward gender sex since the post-war period. But it is only part of the story. Working-class families of color and families that did not follow the heterosexual two-parent nuclear family were not welcome in the suburbs and ended up staying in cities whose entire character changed in the aftermath of the war with the growth of the suburbs. Each city was different despite commonalities that came from the changeover to a service rather than a manufacturing economy and the exit of the white middle class. You have an introduction to Oakland in your readings. I will be using Baltimore for most of my examples here. A theme throughout this class has been the control of people through the control of family structure, which is a women and gender issue. The GI Bill rewarded white heterosexual marriage and excluded pretty much everyone else. From the New Deal era, poor people struggled against social barriers that kept them focused on survival and made class movement in urban America less and less possible. In fairness, concern with affordable housing did not begin and end with the GI Bill. FDR, the architect of the pre-World War II New Deal, had overseen the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation in 1933, which provided mortgage relief to homeowners at risk of foreclosure during the Great Depression. The HOLC also developed a comprehensive housing plan that served as the basis for the National Housing Act of 1934. So we're in the pre-World War II era here. This law created the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, that insured banks, mortgage companies, and other lenders, encouraging the construction of new homes and the repair of existing structures. Although the 1934 National Housing Act and the FHA provided relief to existing homeowners and those with the means to buy homes, it did little to address the needs of poor, particularly Black Americans in urban regions. Many places, like Baltimore, excluded Black Americans in order to ensure white-only neighborhoods. This was a foreshadowing of what would happen with the GI Bill. Expansion of the program to the urban poor depended on congressional legislation. And although Robert Wagner, a senator from New York, introduced public housing bills yearly from 1934, there was too much resistance to pass them. Opposition to low-cost public housing for low-income Americans met resistance from both businesses and politicians. Landlords in the real estate industry saw the loss of profits to cheaper public housing. Supposed fiscal conservatives in Congress complained about the cost and wailed about the perceived dangers of socialism replacing capitalism. Congressmen from rural parts of the country feared that such programs would benefit cities and not smaller communities. FDR put his weight behind the idea of public housing in his second inaugural address, saying, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little." The result of pressure from Roosevelt was legislation that established the United States Housing Authority in 1937 that provided loans for low-cost housing projects across the country in both small and large urban areas. The goal was to make the program self-sustainable through the collection of rents, 1/2 from tenants, 1/3 from the federal government, and the remainder from annual contributions by the specific localities. During World War II, this program was co-opted for the planning and construction of housing for defense workers. Women's studies scholar Rhonda Y. Williams states that many low-income Black women turned for help to the burgeoning welfare state and the social welfare programs initiated during the New Deal. The government, however, offered African American women and their families a mixed bag of opportunity and discrimination, possibilities and restrictions, freedoms and surveillance. Black people did receive some benefits from government programs. Public relief and public housing provided minimal subsistence income and affordable shelter. These programs also enabled Black and poor women to escape domestic abuse and the poverty that was forced on single motherhood. On the other hand, as we know, the initial Social Security legislation excluded agricultural and domestic labor. This actually left 90% of Black women in Baltimore without the benefits of Social Security. The public works programs of the New Deal often denied Black women work, actively pushing them to do agricultural, laundry, or domestic work. Race, sex, class, and political dynamics resulted in unequal citizenship status in the implementation of New Deal programs, which would last through the Second Great Migration of World War II and into the post-war era. The government was far, far more likely to grant subsidized mortgages to white people, while Black people were shunted into public housing. Low-income Black women in particular could only secure support in the form of restrictive means and morals-tested public assistance. This was the lowest tier of programs, yet also the one that evoked the most hostility and which received the most government surveillance. In the late 1930s New Deal era, the U.S. Housing Authority and local management in Baltimore encouraged civic activism. In the early 1940s, public housing residents clubs, and organizations formed in Baltimore as Black residents worked towards decent homes, solid community, and social advancement and respectability. And then came World War II. While defense industry came to Jim Crow Baltimore, industrial plants like the military were segregated, and white communities resisted housing the Black workers who flooded in with the Second Great Migration. As Williams states, Black people found themselves working for a government that criticized fascism and racial hostility abroad, but rarely at home. Coordinated demands for defense worker housing, the emergence of tenant councils, and resident struggles for decency and fairness continued through World War II and set the pattern for the post-war struggles. This brings us back to the 1944 GI Bill and veterans' benefits. If we look back at what the GI Bill offered, guaranteed mortgages were only good if one could find a house in a neighborhood that did not exclude you and a bank willing to give you a loan at all. College tuition was only useful if you could find a college that accepted Black students. You couldn't get unemployment unless you had been employed, and businesses favored hiring white veterans. So that left subsistence payments and public housing, no matter how qualified and tenacious you might be. The racial prejudice woven into the combination of public and private institutions made a genuinely impossible situation. This observation, incidentally, is critical race theory. Nothing wild and off the wall. CRT is just a description of reality. Limitations on employment possibilities combined with childcare responsibilities hit single mothers especially hard. Caught in often no-win situations, poor women created family and community support structures in public housing that did not fit the nuclear family ideal. Williams provides illustrations of the ways that women used public housing to protect themselves and their families. One woman separated from her husband who worked in the Norfolk Naval Yard and moved with her children to Baltimore in the 1950s. She was denied aid to dependent children because Virginia had ordered her husband to pay child support, and that counted as income for her, although he never paid it. Making use of public housing allowed her to keep her children together. Another woman was left caring for her siblings as a young teenager when her mother was rendered paraplegic by a workplace fall. Her paternal grandmother and neighbors formed part of their family network for several years until the children were placed in foster homes. The young woman left high school in the 11th grade, pregnant. She applied for and got public housing, which allowed her to bring her paraplegic mother, her sister, and her youngest brother to form a family around her own children. Divorce, separation, and death could disrupt as many as 40% of families in public housing in the 1950s, when public housing was fairly new and tenant groups were still active. While not suburbia, post-World War II public housing at least allowed resourceful single mothers and non-nuclear families a place to raise children and maintain the bonds of their actual families. Key points for Lecture 19. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, GI Bill of Rights, passed in 1944, granted returning veterans benefits for home ownership, business startups, and education. The benefits of the GI Bill were not equally beneficial to all veterans because of institutionalized racism and the inherent sexism of the heterosexual male breadwinner family model cast as the ideal for all families. White male veterans were able to take advantage of home loans and free education to move into the white suburban middle class. Married female veterans lost most of their GI Bill benefits because of the assumption that their income would be secondary to their husbands. White middle-class women started college, but often dropped out to marry and have children young, as their independent career and economic prospects were limited. While Black veterans were by law entitled to GI benefits, this was not fulfilled in reality when Black men could not find employment or obtain bank loans because of entrenched racial prejudice. Public housing began in the New Deal era, and in the wake of World War II, early public housing, while far from ideal, still created space for single mothers and other families that did not conform to the heterosexual marriage, male breadwinner family model. For the coda, we're going to look at visions of the future from the 1950s. This is a 1950s idea of what sat-nav would look like. 1951, 1953. I'm not sure quite what's happening. The flying saucer becomes part of the car, or those are two separate things, don't know. 1955, I love these ads, looking forward to the future of 1965, because you would want to watch your wash go up and down in the machine in your living room. 1956, the future of telephones, the future of telephones. 1957, home and transportation. Also 1957, another groovy futuristic home. Not sure practically how that works, but it's interesting, if not very private. 1958, closer than we think. Cutting grass and taking care of farm. And last of all, 1959, still a Levittown suburbia, but with flying saucers, driven by Mom. And note the dog. No cat.